Okay, class. So I've just given you a kind of a summary history of the development of chattel slavery in the United States up until the early 1800s. And in the last couple of podcasts, I don't need that. For this week, I want to talk about the origins of the sectional crisis, how slavery drove the northern states and southern states apart to such an extent that a war broke out that historians estimate killed over 700,000 Americans out of a total population of 32 million, by far the bloodiest conflict in our history. And I think to this day, more soldiers, North and South, died in the Civil War than have died in all other wars combined. So, okay. So in front of me, and I'll post this if you can't look at this on a screen, is a map of the United States in 1800. And I just want to propose that had the United States not expanded geographically to the Pacific Ocean, of course, the U.S. expands from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean by 1840, what would you say, 48, I guess, maybe a little bit earlier, but in the 5 decades after 1800. If the United States had not expanded geographically, there might not have been a civil war because over slavery anyway, because the real fight about slavery, and I'll develop this at great length over the course of the semester, was the question of the expansion of slavery and the fights over the expansion of slavery. And let me just kind of tease this one point before I go on. The fights are really about political power. Who would hold the most political power in Washington? States where slavery existed or states where slavery didn't exist? I can't really stress enough to you how the moral question of the Civil War, especially in the North, there's no moral question about slavery in the South. Southerners overwhelmingly supported slavery. But in the North, which is probably over 95% white, people of African descent were concentrated. Not only was slavery concentrated in the states of the South, but African Americans were concentrated in the states of the South. There was very, very strong white supremacist belief. They were racist. Northerners were racist. Okay, I mean let me just put it like that. But that doesn't mean they like slavery. And they didn't necessarily oppose slavery on moral grounds, but they didn't like slavery because they thought it promoted a way of life that they opposed. And let me just leave that. Let me just put a pin in that, and I'll talk about the differences between the North and South of the question of slavery in a future podcast, probably next week. So let's go back to the map. So the Mississippi River was basically the border of the United States after its victory over Great Britain in the American Revolution, and it still left some questions about. There was still territory that had not didn't have enough population to become a state. I think to become a state, you had to have 50,000 population or something along those lines. So anyway, after the American Revolution, and this map is 1800, so let's start there. You'll see that there's no Mississippi and Alabama yet because they haven't reached the population threshold, which they soon will. But you have Kentucky, you have Tennessee, but also look in the north, west of Pennsylvania. You'll see that there's no state of Ohio yet because Ohio has not reached the 50,000 threshold. Now, at this point, everyone kind of concedes that the Mississippi Territory will be slave because it's surrounded by slave territory. I don't think anyone really question that. And then also because of the Northwest Ordinance as well, that Ohio and the Northwest Territory of the River of Ohio. So you have the Southwest Territory, which becomes Alabama and Mississippi, and then the Northwest Territory. Everyone concedes, and actually laws have been passed, that slavery would not exist in the states that became Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin. It was outlawed from those states, where it would probably exist in Mississippi and Alabama when they gained the population threshold necessary to become a state. Okay, so this is the thesis. Had the United States not expanded, what you would have had was basically a consensus on where slavery would have existed, where it wouldn't have existed. There would have been a rough equality in terms of politics between slave states and free states. And it's hard to see the sectional conflict that would have developed that would have torn the country apart. Because again, the fight really by 1860 was the question of the expansion of slavery, not the existence of slavery, but the expansion of slavery. So in 1800, but this was not an issue. This was basically decided. It was decided. The states of what was then the Southwest, and it's called Southwest because the U.S. only stretched to the Mississippi, right? Alabama, Mississippi, that they would be a slave, and that the states of the Northwest, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, kind of, again, if you're a football fan, the Big Ten versus the SEC, but the states of the Northwest would be free. And there would have been a rough equality that, honestly, most Americans, both in the North or South, could have lived with. But then in 1803, the apple cart gets overturned. And here's what happens. The United States purchases Louisiana from France. It's an incredible deal. I can't go into the ins and outs of the Louisiana Purchase, but Napoleon really, we go back to Haiti again. Because of the loss of Haiti, Napoleon just decides to wash his hands of the New World. He's focused on his war with Great Britain. And France controlled this whole area. And again, I'll post this map. France controlled this whole area of the interior of North America. And we tend to forget how much of what's now the United States was controlled by France up until 1803. So long story short, in 1803, Thomas Jefferson cuts a deal with Napoleon. The French initiated it, where the United States purchases this huge area of land in the middle of North America, which ultimately will become 15 U.S. states. This is the Louisiana Purchase. So look at this map. And again, I'm posting this map. You can see how the United States actually doubles in size from 1800 with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Just a quick addendum, Spanish Florida will come in as a slave state in 1819. We buy Spanish Florida from Spain. Southerners wanted Florida because runaway slaves were running away to Spanish Florida to gain their freedom. And there were other reasons. But anyway, Spanish Florida becomes part of the United States, becomes a slave state. And then, of course, Texas. But I'll just stop right there. I want to keep you focused on the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase begins the questions over the expansion of slavery beyond what white folks had settled by 1800. Because now you've got this huge expansive territory, especially Arkansas and Missouri. And the question becomes, would this new territory, once they gain that population threshold of 50,000 and they try to enter the Union as states, would they come into the Union as slave states and thus give Southern political power more clout in Washington? Or would they enter the Union as free states, thus giving the North more political power or clout in Washington? So the point I'm trying to get across to you is American expansionism, manifest destiny, whatever you want to call it, the growth of the United States from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And of course, the United States wasn't done yet. In the 1840s, there would be a huge land acquisition after the war with Mexico. But what we start to see here is American expansionism also starts to open up the question about whether about the expansion of slavery. Would the territory purchased from the French, would it come into the Union once it was divided up into states? It goes from territory, and then, like I say, I think it was 50,000 people you could a territory could apply for statehood. When these territories applied for statehood, would they come into the Union as free or slave? So it becomes really a political question. And what I want to point out here is, and I'm going to talk about it in the next podcast, the first question becomes Missouri. Because Missouri is the first territory that's carved out of the Louisiana Purchase that reaches the 50,000 person threshold necessary to become a state. And in the late 1818 or so, Missouri requests to come into the Union as a slave state. And this sets off the first crisis of union between northern and southern states. And I'm going to talk about that in a separate podcast.